with her presentation on James Anderson and the myth of 1717. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Susan Summers.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. This story begins with the apple tree. It was claimed by James Anderson that the meetings which led to the formation of Grand Lodge were held in the Apple Tree Tavern, Charles Street, Covent Garden, in 1716. If so, the Apple Tree Tavern was a place of fundamental importance in the history of Freemasonry, since it was the scene of what Gould called the most momentous meeting in the history of the craft. We wondered where the Apple Tree Tavern was, who owned it, and what its history could tell us about the context of the creation of the Grand Lodge. But as we tried to seek out the apple tree, the whole story of the formation of Grand Lodge seemed to unravel, and a new account of the birth of the Grand Lodge emerged. Let's see if I can use this.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Oh.
Yay, very good, yep. So let us begin with the traditional story, first reported by James Anderson more than 20 years after the event. After the rebellion was over in AD 1716, the few lodges at London, finding themselves neglected by Sir Christopher Wren, thought fit to cement together under a Grand Master as the center of union and harmony. The lodges that met at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, number 2 at the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane near Drury Lane, at the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden, at the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. They and some old brothers met at the said apple tree, and having put into the chair the oldest Grand Master, now the master of a lodge, they constituted themselves a Grand Lodge pro tempore in due form, and forthwith revived the quarterly communication of the officers of lodges, called the Grand Lodge, resolved to hold the annual assembly and feast, and then choose a Grand Master from amongst themselves, till they should have the honor of a noble brother at their head. Anderson then writes that on 24 June 1717, an assembly and feast was held at the Goose and Gridiron, and that before dinner, the Master Mason who chaired the meeting at the Apple Tree proposed candidates for the office of Grand Master. A vote was taken, and Anthony Sayre was elected as Grand Master of Masons. Wrong way?
Other way? Yes.
Ah, there's a trick to this, and I'll learn it before the talk's over. This story is absent from the 1723 constitutions, and there's no hint of it in any of the numerous works on Freemasonry published at any time prior to 1738. The earliest reference to Grand Lodge in the press is the postboy in June 1721 of the feast at which the Duke of Montague was installed as Grand Master. The first surviving document issued by Grand Lodge is an invitation to the 1722 Grand Feast. The first minute book of Grand Lodge begins on 24 June 1723, and thus the story of 1716-1717 derives entirely from Anderson's history in the 1738 constitutions. Whoops. I think I figured it out now.
There you go.
There we go. We think of Anderson today in a Masonic context as author of the first 2 editions of the Masonic constitutions. In his own time, however, he was known as a controversial minister, historical author, fierce loyalist, Freemason, possible spy, possessor of a celebrated penis, and a debtor. You were supposed to laugh. Our first task, then, is to gain a more nuanced appreciation of the complex man responsible for the myth of the apple tree. So, do I go like this?
Yeah.
Ha, brilliant. Anderson was born in Aberdeen in 1680 into the comfortable family of glazier James Anderson and his wife Jean Campbell. James attended Marischal College from 1694 to 1702, earning an undergraduate diploma and probably an MA in divinity, after which he settled in London. Anderson was hired by a Scots Presbyterian congregation and ordained in December 1707. Contemporary descriptions tell us the new minister was short, slight, auburn-haired, attentive to his appearance, and a bit self-important, sort of like me. A witty companion, learned, Anderson had a quick temper and, quote, has not that guard upon his conduct that serious Christians could wish, unquote. In 1713, Anderson married spinster Anne Griffin. They had 2 children, Catherine in 1716 and James in 1717. Anderson remained close to his family in Aberdeen, and particularly to his brother David, a professor of divinity at King's College, Aberdeen. A third brother, Adam, became an official in the South Sea Office and noted historian of economics. The brothers' closeness had a political component in support of the Hanoverian succession, which all men manifested in their professional and public lives. Well, can you? Thank you. In 1715, Anderson published No King Killers, in which he argues Presbyterians were historically more loyal to legitimate authority than Episcopalians or Anglicans. Anderson's own loyalty to the Protestant succession was often on display and was intertwined with his connection to family and the Kirk in Aberdeen. Hints of this are found in an anonymous rebuttal, No King Sellers, including the earliest reference to Anderson's position as chaplain to the 9th Earl of Buchan. Buchan was a critical figure in Scottish history, and Anderson is keen to note his credentials as a Scottish nationalist, Hanoverian loyalist, and defender of the Church of Scotland. During the rebellion of 1715, Aberdeen was the center of Jacobite agitation, involving the municipal government, craft institutions, and the universities. Afterwards, Jacobites were purged from these centers of authority. For the Andersons, the benefits were striking. When Buchan and the other commissioners arrived in the city in 1716 for the visitation of schools and colleges, they did, quote, everything by information of the Presbyterian clergy and the magistrates, unquote, because Episcopalians were plausibly suspected of being Jacobites. When the inquiry was complete, David Anderson was one of the few academics neither censured nor dismissed. Rather, he was awarded an allowance by the Synod of Aberdeen to repair and extend his house at the university. About this time, James Anderson's critic in London accuses him of eavesdropping around Piccadilly, quote, to pick up lies, which he may transmit to Aberdeen, there to expose such as oppose his grim, graceless idol of persecuting presbytery, unquote. The accusation of spying emphasizes his relationship with the Aberdeen Kirk, and in April 1716, Anderson was indeed chosen to deliver an address of the Synod of Aberdeen, congratulating George I on the victory over the Jacobites to Charles Viscount Townsend, Secretary of State for the Northern Department and one of the architects of the Jacobite defeat.
Give a wave. Yes, just wave it.
5 months later, a curious letter landed on the secretary's desk. Dated 8 September 1716, it's addressed to an unnamed Reverend Sir and signed Brother James Anderson. It is pure sedition, predicting the king's... Yeah.
They need you to speak a little slower because the translator can't.
Okay, I've been told to slow down. It is pure sedition. That means I can be more ironic. Predicting the king's polygamous marriage, and ending with a poem comparing Whigs unflatteringly to Jews. Comparison with examples of Anderson's handwriting does not clarify the question of authorship, though he is surely the imputed author. Whatever its intent, the letter did little to damage the reputation of either David or James Anderson. In fact, greater distinction came to both of them through their connections with the Synod and Presbytery of Aberdeen. In 1727, David was made chaplain to George II with an annual stipend of £50, while James was selected to present the address from the presbytery to George II and, quote, had the honor to kiss His Majesty's hand, unquote. We can best know Anderson as an historian and theologian through his publications. David Stevenson provides a solid analysis of their contents, and we will instead consider how they fit into his life and affected his purse. Anderson's writings should be understood in light of the competing demands of his intellectual and social ambitions and a pressing need for cash. The format of the title pages reveals that aside from the royal genealogies, Anderson did not own the copyright for any of his publications, instead writing manuscripts for copy money, with copyrights and any profits the property of his publishers. This includes both the 1723 and 1738 Masonic constitutions. And while none of his writings paid enough to keep him out of debtor's prison, Anderson's contemporaries believe that the expenses of the royal genealogies helped land him there by January 1736. His financial collapse was not sudden. The Presbyterian Fund, of which he was a member and to which his congregation contributed, sent Anderson extra supplies several times over his career, most poignantly sending £5 a few months after his death. In truth, London dissenting ministers were often poorly paid. While Anderson established his Swallow Street ministry, he and 2 other men purchased the chapel. In time, he was left the sole owner of the dilapidated building. Refurbishment was expensive, as Anderson emphasized in 1729 when he applied to the Crown for a renewal of the lease. In the application, Anderson stressed his zeal for the Hanoverian succession. At about that same time, Anderson's marriage failed, perhaps exacerbated by his precarious finances. While the Andersons' finances strained their marriage, the 1720 publication of 2 satirical pamphlets detailing James's sexual misadventures could not have helped. These consist of a total of 40 pages of verse about James's Presbyterian peasel. Yeah, you heard me. Allegedly, the stoutest prick that ever pissed. You can't make this stuff up. The first pamphlet, Priapia Presbyteriana, explains that Anderson and an unnamed doctor entered into a questionable partnership. All went well until, quote, Tub makes a vigorous sally to Drury or Damnation Alley, where plunging into Venus Puddle, he fired all his diddle-doddle, and for to ease the scalded fool, had mounted the repenting stool. Anderson was clapped, and for a cure went to the doctor, who accidentally circumcised him, forcing him to invent a story to explain the injury. Soon, Anderson's secret was the talk of the town. The second pamphlet is a poetical sermon from the Aberdeen Presbytery reproving Anderson that, quote, the Patriarch of Piccadilly should not have played his cards so silly, nor rashly ventured out in random in unknown depths without a condom. Anderson's main mistake, however, was to go to his friend the doctor, who gossiped, bringing not just Anderson, but Scots, Presbyterians, and the Whig cause into disrepute. However, the author concludes, thy poxing and invalidation were ordained by predestination. The failure in 1734 of a tapestry weaving enterprise added to Anderson's concerns. The project began in 1727, when Jacob Leblond began soliciting for 100 investors at £500 each, just an astronomical sum in those days. Anne and James Anderson invested separately, suggesting a significant commitment of funds by the household. A contemporary reports that the enterprise was ruinously expensive. When cash ran short, quote, everything became so wild that the managers feared for their lives. The contracts which the craftsmen held were termed in such a way that every shareholder was responsible for the company's debts. Some of them were arrested, others escaped the country. The collapse prompted sprawling lawsuits involving dozens of people. James and Anne Anderson are named separately as defendants, with Anne additionally being sought through the press for failing to appear before authorities. In March 1734, the Crown issued a new 40-year lease for the Swallow Street Chapel. The delivery of the lease in Anderson's name only was a shock for his congregation, which promptly hired his replacement, forcing Anderson to ordain the man. Though Anderson attempted to establish a new congregation, he was left without a regular income. An account of a robbery of Anderson's home in November 1735 looks like an attempt to raise some cash, as the servant accused of pawning a substantial list of items was not prosecuted. Within weeks of the theft, Anderson was confined to Fleet Prison. The records show he was never discharged. It is against this backdrop that we encounter Anderson's published works. These include multiple sermons and his 1733 theological treatise, Unity in Trinity, which grew out of a religious debate at Salters Hall. A careful reading of Unity in Trinity offers insight into what Anderson meant by the religion in which all men agree, but how Grand Lodge interpreted that phrase may have been a different matter entirely. Another of Anderson's publications was an abortive attempt to translate David Fossman's historical Dialogues of the Dead. The popularity of the work, published in German as a weekly serial, suggested itself as a profitable enterprise to Anderson and his publishers, John Hook, Richard Ford, and John Graves. After translating these three conversations, published anonymously in 1723 as interviews from the realms of death, the project was delayed and then dropped. In Anderson's words, it being very laborious. Ford was Anderson's most consistent publisher and was also an old acquaintance of John Hook. He most likely recommended Anderson to Hook for interviews, which explains how Anderson made the connection for another 1723 project, The Constitutions of the Freemasons, published by Hook and John Senex. While Anderson's association with Hook and Senex was brief, Ford loyally paid Anderson for religious manuscripts until near the end of both of their lives. Anderson hoped to be remembered as a historian, and Royal Genealogies, published in 1732, is the closest he comes to writing a straightforward history. The excellence of this massive project was recognized by his contemporaries. He was actually a very good historian for his day. It was also a huge expense. Because he owned the copyright, he was responsible for the publication costs, which would have benefited from any profits. The long list of prominent booksellers on the title page is evidence of Anderson's connections, and the importance Anderson attached to the work is emphasized by his associated purchase of a doctorate from Marischal in 1731. In the preface of Royal Genealogies, Anderson thanks the owners of 24 collections of books or manuscripts for their assistance, but it is his own library that most deserves our attention. And this is a picture of part of his book catalog. A single copy survives of the catalog of Anderson's books sold after his death. It lists 1,600 works, about 1,000 of which probably belong to Anderson. The collection is a reflection of his widely ranging research and writing interests and includes texts in 8 languages. A very few recent volumes suggest that even in straitened circumstances, Anderson found money for books. The catalog offers a fascinating glimpse into Anderson's mind and milieu, and a closer analysis is currently underway. If Royal Genealogies was the project of his heart, Anderson's Masonic writings are examples of him writing on commission. No matter what Anderson may have later claimed, Senex and Hook owned the copyright for the 1723 constitutions. Given Hooke and Anderson's concurrent involvement in the Interviews Project, Hooke was likely responsible for introducing Anderson to Grand Lodge. The Masonic background of Anderson's family in Aberdeen, where his father was a Freemason, is often mentioned as a reason for his involvement. However, there is no evidence that Anderson himself was a member before he was commissioned by Grand Lodge in 1721. Thus, we should consider the possibility that he took up membership expressly to become eligible for the job. To see Anderson's mature engagement with Freemasonry, we turn to the 1738 edition of the Constitutions, published by Caesar Ward and Richard Chandler, who held the copyright. They and Anderson, again, paid copy money by the page, favored a much larger volume with the imprimatur of Grand Lodge to maximize their income. Anderson was in Fleet Prison, with time to devote to the task, though he clearly had access to day passes, allowing him to attend lodge meetings and to visit his study at a premises at a bookseller in Exeter Court, where he had hidden his books. When the new constitutions came out, it was more than twice as long as the 1723 edition and more historically and theologically complex. Despite his productivity, Anderson's last months were not tranquil. In July 1737, his name appeared in the Gazette as one of many who hoped to take advantage of the recent Act for Relief of Insolvent Debtors. The notice was inserted by the warden of Fleet Prison to certify those named had been incarcerated on the 1st of January 1736, as required by the Act. In his joy, Anderson preached and published The Lord Looseth Prisoners, in which he makes a personal confession describing how his ambitions had been blasted by the Tapestry Project. Anderson was again destined for disappointment. The Act required debtors to give up all their assets, except for goods up to a value of £10. Anderson's library, necessary for him to work as a historian and genealogist, had 1,000 volumes, but sacrificing it was not an option. Anderson then conceived a desperate alternative. Early in 1738, he announced he would return to his former congregation over its protests. The session book records the drama as Anderson forced his services upon them, emphasizing that he was still their landlord. After several tense interviews, the elders convinced him to accept pensions for himself and his estranged wife. In return, he, quote, resigned all right and claim to Swallow Street. A gap in the session books makes it impossible to determine whether the pensions were paid. Anderson died that May at 59. Desaguliers and 5 Presbyterian ministers served as pallbearers at his funeral, which was attended by about a dozen Freemasons. Later in the year, Anderson's library was sold. It's not clear what became of his daughter, but his widow Anne received a pittance from the Swallow Street Church in February 1744, when the session book tells us she went out to Jamaica to join her son James, who had moved there in 1743 with his wife Jane and son Adam. In the 1740s, white families were offered incentives to settle, and James was reimbursed over £250 and given 260 acres in Portland Parish, which he operated as a plantation. However, that area was remote, and from the outset it seems he rented a house in Kingston as well, and this is likely where his family resided. Though what family was it? Neither Jane nor Anne are named in the record after 1744. In 1750, a child named James Anderson, born to Dr. James Anderson and Anne Morant, a mulatto woman of unknown status, was baptized in Kingston. In 1753, 5-year-old William Anderson, William Anderson, a free mulatto natural son of Abba, a free Negro woman by James Anderson, was presented for baptism. In 1755, giving his address as Kingston, Anderson obtained a medical degree from Marischal College upon paying the fee of 15 guineas. He had been known as Dr. Anderson since at least 1745, but the MD gave him greater freedom to practice, and the following year he was listed as a surgeon on the Jamaica frigate, a privateer. The Andersons have a long history in Jamaica, and I don't have time to really talk about it right now, but it's interesting that within a few generations, they had intermarried with Catholic Jacobite families on the island and were owners or part owners of plantations and at least around 700, 800 slaves. So that's another story. Let's go back to the apple tree. Anderson's account of the 1738 constitutions of the formation of Grand Lodge has long been treated as though it were a primary source, a contemporary source, based on eyewitness accounts. The assumption has been that, as John Hamill recently explained, when Anderson wrote his histories, there were still many around who would have attended or would have known some of those who were present at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, and that they would have corrected him if necessary. However, this section of Anderson's constitutions was not a primary source. It's a history, stitched together by Anderson from various bits of evidence. We can trace some of the sources that Anderson used in trying to compile his history, and they are all problematic. Anderson's 1738 constitutions was scrutinized by a group of Grand Lodge officers, but we do not know who they were, or if they were involved in Freemasonry in 1716. George Payne and Desaguliers, two key figures, were still active as Grand Officers in 1738, but many of the other Grand Officers were recent initiates. Reading the Grand Lodge minutes reveals a very shaky collection of the collective memory of the early days. Anderson himself was a relative newcomer and had no direct knowledge of earlier events. He was, however, a historian, collecting oral and written testimony which he tried to reconcile. Turning to the 1738 constitutions, we find a list of encouragers of the work. Of the handful of Freemasons listed who were involved with Freemasonry in the early 1720s, only one claimed to have participated in the events of 1716, 1717. This was Carpenter Jacob Lamble, who was allegedly appointed first senior Grand Warden at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717. It appears that Lamble was one of Anderson's major sources of information about 1716, 1717, despite the fact that there are enormous doubts about his credibility as a witness. Although Lamble was said to have been made a Grand Officer in 1717, there is no independent evidence of his involvement with Freemasonry until March 1735, when he suddenly appears acting as Grand Warden in the place of Sir Edward Mansell. This was at the quarterly communication immediately after the one at which Anderson proposed a new edition of the Constitutions, and it looks suspiciously like Anderson might have been responsible for Lamble's appearance in Grand Lodge. It is not known how Lamble's claim to have been Grand Warden was tested in 1735, but there are problems with his story. Most seriously, Lamble was only an apprentice carpenter in 1717. He was not master of his own time. He had no money. It's implausible to suggest that he was active in setting up a Grand Lodge. Anderson also made use of written sources. Most importantly, he had access to the minute books of Grand Lodge. At the end of the first minute book is a list of Grand Lodge officers, beginning with Sayer as Grand Master and Lamble and Joseph Elliott as wardens. This list was altered by Anderson, who after the entry for William Hawkins as warden in 1723 added the words, "who demitted," and then James Anderson, AM, was chosen in his place. Whatever we may think of Anderson's behavior in altering the minute book, this tampering establishes that the list was compiled independently of Anderson and was used by him as a source. However, this list is also a late piece of evidence. It was inserted by Grand Secretary William Reed in the Minute Book sometime in the 1730s and reflects rumors and claims current in Grand Lodge at the time that Anderson was working on his history. Anderson did his best to piece together the tall stories told by people like Lamble and the fragments of written information in sources such as minute books. Unfortunately, he also takes liberties with his sources, adding embellishments, fabricating events that did not happen, and inflating his own role in the development of Grand Lodge. The mixture of fact and fiction in Anderson's history is illustrated by the case of the Apple Tree Tavern itself. The Apple Tree did exist in 1738 when Anderson's book was published. Its licensee was James Douglas, and it stood in Covent Garden at the address which is now 28 Wellington Street, currently a Bella Italia restaurant. I may have a picture of that, I'm not sure. Did it change?
It did change.
Okay.
There's not a picture.
Okay. Let's go back. Can we go back? Yeah. Anderson invented the apple tree narrative because he was told to do so by Grand Lodge. In 1723, Anderson described somewhat vaguely how Masonry stretched back to the beginning of time. Now he was instructed by Grand Lodge to bring that narrative out of myth and into memory, providing a comprehensive list of all the Grand Officers, including Grand Stewards. Anderson was requested to do this for two primary reasons. The first was because it was intended that in future, all Grand Officers would be selected from this group of respectable men who had proven themselves in office. This was intended to enhance the social exclusivity of Grand Officers and reduce the likelihood that they would make demands on Grand Lodge's charitable funds, as several of the alleged first Grand Officers had already done. The second was simply political. Led by Desaguliers, Grand Lodge was aligning itself with the Patriot opposition to the government of Walpole, centered on Frederick Lewis, Prince of Wales. The dedication of the 1738 constitutions to Frederick and its presentation to him by Grand Lodge were strong expressions of support at a time when the prince was excluded from the king's household and seen by the opposition as the best hope for restoring the mixed constitution undermined by Walpole. Influenced by Bolingbroke's remarks on the history of England, the Patriot opposition stressed the importance of, quote, a sense of continuity and pride in what it meant to be a Briton, and an awareness of ancient British liberty and independence. Anderson's history of Freemasonry was meant to show Grand Lodge was rooted in an ancient English institution, but had been revitalized by the Hanoverian succession, the future of which was embodied in the Prince of Wales. Thus, if not for the late and suspect testimony of Anderson and the list of officers in the Grand Lodge Minute Book, we would assume that Grand Lodge was created during 1721. There are no contemporary references to Grand Lodge between 1717 and 1721. No press reports, no anti-Masonic pamphlets, no diary entries, no theatrical burlesques, no mention of the tavern or its lodge, no rude prints. Without corroborating documentary evidence, we must discard the canonical story. But then what happened? Two further sources demonstrate that the explanation for the pre-1721 silence is that Grand Lodge was indeed established in 1721 and not before. These sources are first, the papers of the physician, antiquary, and natural philosopher William Stukeley, and second, a book in the archives of the Lodge of Antiquity in London. Both are contemporary, and because of the circumstances of their creation, are inherently more likely to be reliable than the later researches of Anderson. William Stukeley was a friend of Isaac Newton, one of the founders of the Society of Antiquaries of London, and he undertook pioneering archaeological work on Stonehenge. He records in his diary that he was made a Freemason at the Salutation, a well-known tavern in Covent Garden. Stukely also stated, quote, "I was the first person to be made a Freemason in London for many years. We had great difficulty to find members enough to perform the ceremony. Immediately after that, it took a run." That is to say, it became very fashionable. Stukely's claim that it was difficult to find enough Freemasons to perform an initiation in 1721 is impossible to reconcile with Anderson's narrative, which states that the number of lodges was at that time rapidly increasing. The Salutation was a few minutes' walk from the apple tree, and there would have been no difficulty in finding Freemasons for an initiation if a lodge was really meeting at the apple tree. For Stukely, the key event in the growth of Freemasonry was the installation of the Duke of Montagu at Stationers' Hall in June 1721. Unlike Anderson, Stukely attended this event. He provides a much more experiential account of the dinner, which stresses the attendance of prominent Whig nobles, such as Lord Stanhope and Lord Herbert. This was indeed Freemasonry taking a run. The impression given by Stukely's diary of Grand Lodge bursting on the scene dramatically and suddenly in 1721 is corroborated by a contemporary minute describing the dinner on 24th June 1721, at which Montagu was made Grand Master, which is preserved in the records of the Lodge of Antiquity No. 2, the lodge which met at the Goose and Gridiron. The record has been largely overlooked, and we're grateful to the worshipful master, secretary, and brethren of the Lodge of Antiquity for permission to consult this record and take images. This minute can be confidently dated to 1721 because of its handwriting and also because of a contemporary trade card of a member of the lodge in the binding, which you see here. Describing the 1721 meeting as, quote, "a general assembly of a great number of Freemasons," the minute declares that the Duke of Montagu was installed in due form as Grand Master of Masons and swore on the Bible, quote, "to observe and keep inviolate in all time coming the franchises and liberties of the Freemasons of England and all the records of ancient time in the custody of the Old Lodge of St. Paul in London." Montagu declared that he, quote, "firmly held and bound never to connive at any encroachment on the landmarks of the old lodges in England, or to suffer the same to be done by his successors, who shall also be bound by oath to the same." In return, the old lodges agreed to surrender their privileges in trust to a new body, which was the Grand Lodge. This day, the Freemasons of London, in the name of themselves and the rest of their brethren of England, vested their separate and distinct rights and powers of congregating in chapter, etc., in the present old lodges in London in trust, and the same this day publicly recognized and notified to their brethren in Grand Lodge assembled. The masters of the old lodges accepted the trust for their lodges and were sworn accordingly. Thus, the fullest and most detailed contemporary account of the installation of the Duke of Montagu states that the act of vesting the privileges of the old London lodges in the Grand Master and Grand Lodge took place not at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, but at the meeting in Stationers' Hall in 1721. This account is convincing, not only because it is a more contemporary report than Anderson's, but also because it fits Stukely's account and the pattern of evidence from newspapers and elsewhere. Grand Lodge was founded not at the Goose and Gridiron on 24 June 1717, but 4 years later, when the London lodges made this formal transfer of their privileges to the new body. Anderson's account of what happened between 1717 and 1721 should be discarded. The legend that Anthony Sayre, Lamble, and others had been Grand Lodge officers before 1721 was cultivated by them in order to secure charity from Grand Lodge. Grand Lodge connived in their claims in order to strengthen its jurisdiction over the older time immemorial lodges and to demonstrate its own antiquity. If we accept that Grand Lodge was founded not in 1717, but when the Duke of Montagu was installed as Grand Master in 1721, this has major implications for our understanding of early 18th century Freemasonry. There's not time to discuss it in detail here, but I would like, in conclusion, to summarize what seem to be a few key points for further investigation. First, we must mention Anthony Sayre, the supposed first Grand Master, who may or may not have looked like this. We're not sure. We can see how stories about connections in the early days of Grand Lodge were invented by looking at the story of Sayre himself. The fragments of information about Sayre show a man in straitened circumstances. He lived in a poor neighborhood and relied on the charity of fellow Masons to keep warm in the winter. His first wife, Elizabeth, was violently assaulted in the street by a group of Irish women in 1736 and died the following year. In 1739, Sayre married a widow named Eliza May in a cheap and discreet fleet marriage. Sayre's claim to have been made Grand Master is not mentioned in the 1723 constitutions. Sayre was also silent about this claim in 1724, when he was an early applicant for charitable help from Grand Lodge. In April 1730, Sayre petitioned Grand Lodge again, describing his great misfortunes and poverty, and now for the first time strengthened his claim by declaring he was a former Grand Master. The Grand Lodge was divided as to how to react to Sayre's plea. Some were willing to give him 20 pounds. Others thought this was far too generous and only wanted to give him 10 pounds. In the end, it was agreed to give him 15, but only on account of having been Grand Master, suggesting that only someone with such exceptional claims might expect assistance. Within a few months, Sayre was accused by the master and wardens of Queen's Head Lodge of making Masons irregularly, suggesting Sayre had found another way of turning his claim to have been Grand Master to financial advantage. These tensions around charitable funds were prominent drivers in the early history of Grand Lodge. The next avenue of exploration is political. There are complex cross-currents that need to be explored. A recent study by Andrew Hannam of the creation of the Order of the Bath by Montagu in 1725 shows he was keenly interested in creating new social institutions to support the Hanoverian monarchy, which purported to have deep historical roots in England. It seems likely both the Order of the Bath and the Grand Lodge of Freemasons were intended to help bind the kingdom's divisions and reconcile key constituencies to the Hanoverian dynasty. So this would be a reference in a larger sense to the events of the 17th century, but more immediately to the Jacobite rebellion of 1715 and to the succession of the Hanoverians upon the death of Queen Anne. As an inevitable result, both new creations had strong Jacobite undercurrents. The key figure in the creation of the Order of Bath was John Anstis of the College of Heralds, who was accused of participation in the 1715 rebellion. Montagu's partner in the creation of Grand Lodge was apparently the Duke of Wharton, a covert Jacobite who began plotting against Montagu almost as soon as Grand Lodge was created. Finally, this revision of the foundation story of Grand Lodge emphasizes the significance of Scotland in the story of early Freemasonry. It now appears that the visit of Desaguliers to Edinburgh in August 1721, immediately after the founding of the English Grand Lodge, was very much a fact-finding expedition for the new Grand Lodge to try to figure out more about Scottish Freemasonry. Moreover, it appears that concern about the formation of the Scottish Grand Lodge was a significant motive in the creation of the myth of 1717. Above all, the creation of Grand Lodge in June 1721 was very much a political act. The events at Stationers' Hall, 1721, show how Freemasonry was a dynamic focus of political, cultural, and social interplay from the very earliest days of Grand Lodge, a role it was to retain throughout the 18th century. Thank you very much. I tried to go slow. I'm a fast talker. My apologies.
I hope those of you who are having the translation in French, I hope you kept up, because it was worth listening to. I did promise you something interesting, didn't I? It was worth getting up for. You accused yourself at one stage, Susan, of being perhaps a little self-important. Well, whether you are or not.
I'm also short and red-headed.
Short and red, yes. You have every right to be, because what you have presented to us is extremely important. You have gone back to original documents. You've done a proper historian's job. Some of those documents are found in the United States, interestingly. Many of these documents you find for the first time, and then you tell us what really happened, or in some cases, what didn't happen. And I'm just astounded that for 300 years, people repeat the stories over and over again without having the evidence to support it. And I, like everyone else, talked about the Apple Tree Tavern, and the tourists are taken to the, the Goose and Gridiron, and so on and so on. So it was fascinating to hear what Anderson was, and perhaps what he wasn't. I have a personal interest in this, in that one of my ancestors, G. Kearsley, printers and publishers of Fleet Street, printed some of these things as well, so they were probably in on the plot as well. Well, I suspect that people want to make their own comments or ask a few questions. So who's going to kick us off? Don't be shy.
There's a hand in the back.
Or are you stunned into silence?
No, there's someone waving back there.
Right. It's very hard for us to see.
We can't see you,
yeah.
but we can hear you.
Oui. Merci beaucoup pour cette intervention. Visiblement, James Anderson n'était ni libre ni de bonne mœurs. Alors, comment a-t-il pu créer une institution aussi libre et de bonne mœurs qu'il souhaitait le faire, et comment il a pu être suivi? Parce que j'imagine mal que les contemporains puissent le suivre de cette affaire sans regarder un petit peu sa vie et son pédigré. Merci.
I'm sorry, sir, but we didn't bring the
Yeah,
earphones.
I'm up the proverbial shit creek.
Well-
I don't understand French, and I don't have...
Would
Can
somebody
someone
just translate
for me?
for us? Could just somebody translate what the question was?
You can translate. Or do you have a question?
I think what's being asked is, how could a man of good character like James Anderson have formed such an institution, or an institution of people of good character wanted to have anything to do with him?
Oh, okay.
Good point.
I think Anderson is a man of good character, as much as any of us are. None of us are perfect. There are always feet of clay. I think it's an important point to make that neither Anderson nor Grand Lodge saw themselves as lying. They were trying to put together the history of an institution which they fully believed had very ancient roots. And the presentation in 1721 at that feast and the installation of Montague of what later comes to be known as the Cook manuscript, one of the old charges manuscripts, proved to them, indeed, as far as they were concerned, conclusively, that Freemasonry was at least 500 years old in England. And what they were trying to do was connect themselves to that ancient and genuinely British institution and make it useful to them in the 18th century for the challenges that they were being faced with at that point. history has always served purposes. And our demand for history to be unbiased is a very new thing. And it's not legitimate for us to apply that requirement to historians of previous eras. You know, our idea of using sources and citing sources and all of that really is just coming into being at the end of the 18th century. So I don't think we need to question any of their character. They all believed that they were doing something good and for good reason. And what we're actually doing by asking these questions is just showing that we need to immerse ourselves a little bit more in the milieu. I hope that helps. Well,
there's one over there, isn't there?
I had a question about what you think, why the details of the Apple Tree Tavern, why the details of the Goose of Gridiron, and if they're trying to extend themselves back, why 4 years? That doesn't seem, why not 10 years or 15 years?
that's a great question. Because they had already, if you read the Grand Lodge minutes, Lamble and Sayre had already identified themselves, and they'd been written into the record. And if you look at it, so we clearly have to have a revival, right? Because there was Christopher Wren, and then there was the Jacobite Rebellion, and then what happened? Well, then Sayre and Lamble put themselves forward, and they're not the only ones. And so that, when I talk about moving from myth into memory, that's when it happens. And you know, he already had that line going all the way back to Adam. And that marvelous historical thing that goes all the way back into antiquity is in his royal genealogies as well. And what he does there is he takes, you know, every royal family all over the world, like even Montezuma, all the way back to Adam, and back to like Venus and Zeus. And at the end of it, at the end of his introduction to royal genealogies, he said every nation should be left to enjoy its own fables. So he recognizes that, you know, some of this stuff probably didn't happen, but it's important anyway. So I hope that helps.
You hear the expression, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? And of course, we do this, and even in our rituals, for example, we refer to ourselves as older than the golden fleece. Our order is more noble than the garter, and so on and so on.
I've met some Freemasons who were older than the golden fleece.
Some are. Any more questions? Is it somebody over there?
Yeah.
It's very hard for us to see. Are you in French? Un moment, s'il vous plaît.
How do you turn this on?
Take that one. Is yours working?
Barely.
You've got a volume on the right. We can't hear the question. We can't hear you. The mic is not on. You need to put the microphone on.
It was not the... Voilà. Bien. Avant même la révision que vous proposez de l'histoire de 1717-1721, la théorie classique, la documentation classique, présentait plus Anderson comme un rédacteur, comme commis pour faire ce texte et raconter cette histoire, que vraiment comme un acteur. Et souvent, l'historiographie classique mettait en avant Jean Théophile des Aguiliers comme le véritable acteur derrière la plume d'Anderson. Est-ce que votre approche de la question confirme ça? Well, even I will try to do it in English. Even the classical presentation of 1717 usually said that Anderson was only a pencil in this story. He was committed to write the story, but he was not a true actor of this story. And usually historians say that behind Anderson, the true actor of the story was Desaguliers. Is your analysis converge with that, or what about the respective role Anderson and Desaguliers in the 1717 story?
I couldn't understand, couldn't get the translation, so I'm going to have to go with what I think you said. Anderson is frequently portrayed as being the sole author of this and the source. And what I hope I've shown is that he's told to write a comprehensive story, and he tries to put things together. Certainly, what is emerging from our research, which is ongoing, we're still finding stuff and we're still revising our interpretation, is that Montague is the primary agent, and that Desaguliers and George Payne and some of the other really big names in the early Grand Lodge were assistants, and they were cooperating with him, and they were very important. Desaguliers and Payne in particular, because of roles that I've already mentioned today. But Anderson was there. Anderson was the hired pen, but he was also a very talented hired pen. And so I think if we say, what did Anderson mean, or what was Anderson trying to get at, then we're missing who was really deciding what to do and just hiring people like Anderson to help get it done. Does that answer? Yes. Okay.
Another question. Is there, do you find a link with the London company, London Masons livery, London Masons Company, and the First Grand Lodge? Usually, in my memory, I think that one man was coming from this London Masons Company. But what about your research on maybe link between the London Mason Company and the First Grand Lodge?
I hate to disappoint you, but we haven't gotten that far yet.
So no link at all.
So I have no idea. If Andrew were here and he sends his regrets, he has a deeper knowledge of that than I do. But that's not a topic we have written about or we have been researching yet. So I have no answer for you. Ask me again in a year.
More questions?
There's
one blow. That's not working. What? You've got one? Okay.
1, 2, 3, test. What do you make of Anderson's claim that in former times the Grand Lodge was a quarterly meeting of lodge officers rather than an association of individual lodges? Is there anything to somehow corroborate that account?
Where is Prescott when you need him? It's a stretch to make too much of a direct connection between what happens in 1721 and really anything that happened before. They're obviously trying to make that connection, and they're trying to give it as many elements of plausibility as possible. And if you go back and look at the old charges, they do talk about annual assemblies and things like that. And so I suspect, although don't quote me on this, because my big thing has been finding out about Anderson, that's probably one of the details that they picked up from the old charges and brought forward. But if you send me an email asking me, I'll forward it, or I'll look at my notes, and I'll try to come up with a better answer for you. Okay.
I suspect that even at the time, people realized that the Freemasons were exaggerating a little. I'm sure many of you have heard of a group called the Gormagons. This group, whether it existed or not, gained a lot of publicity by putting adverts in the newspapers at the time, claiming an even longer antiquity than the Freemasons. Whatever the Freemasons said, they did it better. So if the Freemasons were going to have a meeting of 100 members, they were going to have 10,000. The entire Pope and all the cardinals were all members of the Gormagons, and so on and so on. And they were specifically making fun of the Gormagons, although there's no evidence, I think, that they ever actually existed as a group or ever did have a meeting. So maybe people even then realized there was an element of exaggeration.
Oh yeah. And you know, the interesting thing about the Apple Tree Tavern, that story, we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much that nobody has investigated the story before, because it's a brilliant story. It's really wonderful. It's so wonderful that if you look at other associations in 18th century England, all of which have invented histories, many of them say, like the Druids, for example, say, you know, our first meeting was at the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street in 1716. So this is a very appealing, very attractive story, and not just the Freemasons, but all the other various associations were coming up with wonderful claims of antiquity and nobility at the same time. So you know, we shouldn't think that Freemasonry is somehow fenced off as being unique in this regard.
Questions? Comments? Can't see anything. There's a wonderful program in England called Qi, which stands for Quite Interesting, and it's run by Stephen Fry, and they have two panels, and they discuss various things and prove that everything you ever believed is probably not true. Everything. All those urban myths and all those stories that we absolutely believe. And I think Susan's cracked another egg today, and that we're all 4 years too early.
Another good excuse for a party.
Yes, let's come back in 4 years' time. I don't think it's going to make any difference whatsoever to UGLE, because they've booked the venues and they've ordered the sandwiches and the drinks, so it's going ahead. So 1717 it is, whether you like it or not. But today you heard the truth. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for riding on me. I normally speak so quickly.
Just what you're saying is so interesting.
I cut out stuff.
I want to savor
I
every
cut
word.
out stuff. If anyone wants to contact either Andrew or myself, I have cards down here, and you can pick one up and forward questions. I'll be happy to talk to you.
Well done. Now, what I would love to do is to have Tracy as the lead article next issue.
A précis of this.